The moment Etta Hurst saw the man slumped against the hitching post outside the saloon in Caldwell, Kansas, in the blazing September of 1878, she knew two things with absolute certainty: that he was not drunk, and that whatever had broken inside him was far worse than whiskey could ever cause. She had seen drunks before. She had seen men hollow with liquor, men made loud and stupid by it, men weeping into their glasses over cards they had lost or women who had left them. Oscar Whitfield was none of those things. He sat perfectly still in the dust, one knee drawn up to his chest, his hat pushed back on his head, and his right hand closed around something she could not see. His eyes were open and fixed on the middle distance, on something that did not exist in the street before him, on something that existed only in whatever country grief had made inside him. Etta had been in Caldwell for exactly 6 days. She had come from Abilene carrying one carpet bag, $42 sewn into the hem of her second dress, and a determination so fierce it sometimes frightened her in the morning when she caught her own face in the small tin mirror she kept in her bag. She was 24 years old, sharp-featured and dark-haired, with eyes the color of good creek water on a clear day. She had been a schoolteacher in Abilene, and she had been good at it, and she had left because the man she thought she might one day marry had chosen another woman, and then had the cruelty to ask Etta if she would teach his new bride to read more properly. She had packed her bag that same night. Caldwell was a cattle town, straddling the Kansas border with Indian Territory to the south. In 1878, it was loud and new and rough, the streets thick with drovers pushing longhorns north from Texas, and the air carrying the permanent smell of cattle and dust, and the particular sharp tang of a town that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. Etta had taken a room above the dry goods store owned by a widow named Mrs. Prentice, a stout, practical woman who charged fair rent and asked no questions so long as her boarders were quiet after 9 o'clock in the evening. Etta had gone out that morning to see about a position. She had heard there was a need for a schoolteacher in Caldwell, that the previous one had left suddenly in June when her father had died back east and she had not returned. Etta had her letters of reference neatly folded in her coat pocket, and she had walked the length of the main street twice already, trying to find the man named Alderman Cooper, who was apparently the person in charge of such decisions. She had not found him yet, but she had found Oscar Whitfield, or rather she had nearly walked directly over him, which was how she came to stop and look at him more carefully than she might otherwise have done. "Are you all right?" she asked. It was a plainly absurd question. He was plainly not all right, but she asked it anyway, the way you ask a question when the silence feels more dangerous than the words. He looked up at her slowly, as though surfacing from deep water. His face was angular and weathered in the way of men who spent most of their lives outside, with a jaw that was shadowed with a few days of dark stubble, and eyes that were a gray so pale they looked nearly silver in the morning light. He was perhaps 28 or 29, though grief had added something to him that aged a man without adding years. "Yes, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and careful, the voice of a man who had remembered at the last moment that courtesy existed. "Just resting." "You are resting against a hitching post," Etta said, "in the full sun in September, in Kansas." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the shadow of where one had been. "I suppose that is not the most sensible choice I have ever made." "It is not," she agreed. She hesitated because she had not been raised to speak to strange men in the street, but she had also been raised to be practical, and practically speaking, there was something about this man's stillness that concerned her. "Can I fetch you some water? There is a pump just there." He looked at the pump as though he had forgotten water was a thing that existed. "No," he said. "Thank you." He paused. "I appreciate the kindness." She nodded, and she should have walked on. She knew she should have walked on. But she saw then what he had been holding in his right hand, because he shifted slightly and his fingers uncurled for just a moment before closing again, and in that moment she saw the glint of gold. A ring. A small gold ring, the kind a woman might wear. She did not say anything about it. She had enough wisdom for that, at least. She simply said, "My name is Etta Hurst. I have just come from Abilene. I am looking for work as a schoolteacher." He looked at her again, with slightly more alertness this time, as though the ordinary fact of her ordinary life had pulled him a fraction closer to the world where such things mattered. "Oscar Whitfield," he said. "I have a ranch about 8 miles south of here, near the territory line." "That sounds like a lonely place," she said without thinking. "It is," he said quietly and without any defensiveness at all. "At the moment it is exactly that." She felt the weight of those words settle between them. She did not push. She simply said, "I hope your day improves, Mr. Whitfield," and she walked on toward the far end of the street where she had been told Alderman Cooper kept his office. She did not think, as she walked, that this moment was anything more than a brief exchange between two strangers on a dusty street. She did not think it would amount to anything at all. She was wrong. Etta found Alderman Cooper, a round-faced, amiable man of 50 who smelled strongly of pipe tobacco and wore a coat that had been good quality once, perhaps a decade prior. He interviewed her for the teaching position with the careful attention of a man who had been disappointed before, asked her several questions about her methods, examined her references with the slow deliberateness of someone who was not entirely sure what he was looking for, and then hired her on the spot with a handshake and a salary of $28 a month. She walked back along the main street feeling better than she had felt in 6 days, and she noticed that Oscar Whitfield was no longer at the hitching post. This was, she told herself, a relief rather than a disappointment. It meant he had gathered himself together and gone about his day. It meant whatever quiet emergency had held him in the dust had passed, at least enough for him to stand and move. She bought coffee and a small tin of preserved peaches from Mrs. Prentice's store, because a new position deserved a small celebration, and she went upstairs to her room and sat in the chair by the window and ate the peaches with a spoon and watched the street below and thought about what she was going to do with the rest of her life. She was still thinking about it when she saw him again, 3 days later. He came into town on a gray horse, the kind of well-muscled, steady-gaited animal that spoke of serious work rather than show. He rode the way men raised on horseback rode, with an ease that looked like carelessness but was not. He tied the horse at the rail outside the feed store and went inside, and came out again 20 minutes later with 2 sacks of feed which he loaded across the horse with practiced efficiency. Etta was crossing the street toward the school, which was a single-room building on the north end of the main road, and she stopped at the edge of the boardwalk because she had nearly walked into him the first time, and she did not intend to repeat the experience. "Mr. Whitfield," she said. He turned and something shifted in his face when he saw her, recognition and something more complicated than recognition. "Miss Hurst," he said, "you found your position then." "I did," she said. "I begin teaching on Monday." "Good," he said, and he seemed to mean it genuinely. "Caldwell needs a good teacher. The last one was fine, but she was not planning to stay, and children can tell the difference." Etta tilted her head. "Have you children in the school?" He was quiet for just a moment. "No," he said, "not now. I have a niece who attends, though, my brother's girl, Clara. She is 7. "I look forward to meeting her," Etta said. She paused, and then, because she had decided somewhere in the last 3 days that she was not going to be the kind of woman who let things go when they mattered, she said, "I hope you are faring better than you were when I last saw you." He looked at her steadily. He did not seem offended. "Some," he said. "Some better." "Good," she said, with the same simple sincerity he had used, and she walked on. The school was 9 children, ranging in age from Clara Whitfield, who was indeed 7 and had her uncle's pale gray eyes and considerably more happiness in them, to a boy of 14 named Douglas who sat in the back row and made it clear he considered himself too old for this but was here because his mother insisted. Etta managed them all with a brisk warmth that she had learned over 4 years in Abilene. The trick was to be interested in them genuinely, not as students but as small people, and small people generally responded to that by becoming interested in you in return. By the end of the first week, she had Douglas reading aloud voluntarily, which his previous teacher had apparently never achieved. She had also learned a great deal about the community around Caldwell, because children are the most honest reporters of the world they live in, and they talk. She learned, through the careful triangulation of 6 separate children's observations, that Oscar Whitfield had moved to the ranch south of town 3 years ago, and that he had brought a wife with him who was from somewhere further east, and that his wife had died the previous winter. The details were imprecise in the way of children's information. Some said it was a fever. One insisted it had been a difficult birth. Another said she had heard it was both, that the child had not survived either. But the essential fact was consistent and delivered without cruelty, just with the matter-of-fact quality of children who had grown up in a place where hard things happened and were spoken of plainly. Etta thought of the ring in his closed fist, and felt something move through her chest that was not quite sorrow and not quite recognition, and was, she told herself firmly, certainly not the beginning of anything complicated. She told herself this several times over the following 2 weeks. October came in with a change in the air, the first real bite of cold riding in from the north, and the town settled into its autumn rhythm. The cattle drives were trailing off, the rough energy of the summer drovers fading as the season turned, and Caldwell began to feel more like the town it was trying to become rather than the temporary stopping place it had been all summer. Etta had, by this point, established a life of small, solid pleasures. She liked her morning walk to the school. She liked the coffee Mrs. Prentice made, which was strong enough to bear up under any difficulty. She liked the hour in the evening after supper when she sat with her lamp and read, working through a collection of novels she had brought from Abilene with a methodical enjoyment. She was not unhappy. She was not unhappy at all. She saw Oscar Whitfield every week or so when he came to town. They had developed a habit of speaking when they encountered each other, brief exchanges in the street or outside the feed store, or once, memorably, in the hardware store where they had both reached for the same spool of wire at the same moment, and then stood looking at each other with their hands inches apart and neither of them quite laughing. He was not, she observed, a man who spoke easily about himself. He answered questions directly when they were asked, but he did not volunteer and he listened more than he talked. She had noticed that about him from the beginning, but when he did speak, it was with a clarity she respected, an absence of the hedging and circling that a lot of men did when they wanted to say one thing and were saying another. Oscar Whitfield, when he said a thing, meant it. She had not seen the ring again. She thought about it sometimes. She thought about the way his hand had been closed around it, the way something in his whole body had been closed around it the same way, and she thought about what it meant to carry something like that in your hand in the middle of a street in the middle of the day. The first real conversation they had, the kind that went past politeness and into something actual, happened on the second Saturday of October. There was a small social in the church hall, the kind of community gathering that Caldwell organized a few times a year, with music and food and children running underfoot while adults stood in loose groups and talked. Etta went because Mrs. Prentice said it would be good for her standing in the community, and because she genuinely liked the people she had met in Caldwell and wanted to know them better. She found herself standing near the window with a plate of food she was only partly eating, watching the room with the teacher's habit of observation, when Oscar Whitfield appeared beside her. He had cleaned up for the occasion, his shirt was pressed and his hair was combed and he had shaved, which altered his face considerably, making him look simultaneously younger and less defended. "You look surprised to see me here," he said. "I am," she admitted. "You did not strike me as a man who attended socials." "I am not," he said. "My brother dragged me." He indicated a man across the room who was vigorously shaking hands with Alderman Cooper. He looked like a taller, broader, louder version of Oscar, with the same pale eyes but considerably more of a smile on his face. "That is Robert. He believes that I have been on my own on that ranch long enough, and that I need to be reminded that other people exist." "He may have a point," Etta said, and then immediately worried that this was too direct. But Oscar looked at her sideways with something that was definitely, this time, the edge of a real smile. "He does," he said. "He usually does. I just find it easier to ignore his points when he is 8 miles away." "What brought you to Caldwell?" she asked. "Originally, I mean, you are not from here." "Virginia," he said. "Robert and I came out in '74. There was nothing to keep us there after the war, and the land here was available, and we both of us had enough of a complicated past that a great deal of empty space seemed like a reasonable cure." He paused. "I met my wife on the journey. She was traveling with her family from Ohio. We were married in Missouri." He said it without drama, just as a fact, but she felt the weight of it. She said nothing because she had learned that silence was sometimes a kindness. "Her name was Josephine," he said after a moment. "Joe. She wanted this more than I did at first, the ranch, the territory, all of it. She was the braver of the two of us." He stopped. "I apologize. I do not know why I am telling you this." "Because I asked about what brought you here," Etta said simply, "and that is the true answer." He looked at her then, directly and for long enough that she felt it in her hands and then felt foolish for feeling it there. "Yes," he said, "I suppose it is." They talked for another hour, standing by that window while the room moved around them. She told him about Abilene and the school there, and about her family in Missouri, her father who had been a minister and her mother who had run the actual affairs of the town from behind the facade of being a minister's wife. She told him about the student she was most proud of, a girl named Mercy in Abilene who had come to school at age 12, having never been taught a letter, and who, by the time Etta left, had been reading novels. He told her about the ranch, about what it had been like to build something from raw ground, about the 2 ranch hands he employed, men named Corbin and Pete who had drifted up from Texas and were now as fixed to the place as the fence posts. He told her about the land itself, the way it rolled down toward the territory line, the creek that ran through the south pasture, the cottonwood grove that turned gold in October. "It sounds beautiful," she said. "It is," he said. "It is a beautiful, difficult place." She thought that this was also a description of grief and perhaps of him, and she thought it with more warmth than she strictly ought to have. The social ended. He walked her back to Mrs. Prentice's door, because it was dark, and because he was that kind of man, not performatively gallant but genuinely attentive in the way of someone who had been raised to think about other people's safety. At the door he took off his hat, and she saw that his hair in the lamplight was very dark with threads of silver at the temples, and she thought he was the most quietly compelling person she had encountered in years. "Good night, Miss Hurst," he said. "Good night, Mr. Whitfield," she said. She went upstairs and sat by her window and told herself very sternly that she was a sensible woman, and that she had not come to Caldwell to complicate herself with a man who was carrying his dead wife's wedding ring in his fist like a talisman against the world. But the wind came up in the night and rattled the window glass, and she listened to it and thought of the cottonwood grove turning gold in October, and of pale gray eyes, and of a man who had said his wife was the braver of the two of them, with a love in his voice so absolute and so clear that it broke something open in Etta's chest that she had not known was closed. November arrived with cold intent. The first frost came in the second week of it, silvering the grass and making the mornings bite. Etta was firmly established in the school by now, known in the town as a good teacher and a sensible woman, which was the highest praise Caldwell generally offered. She had been invited to supper at 3 different households and had gone to all of them and come away feeling more rooted in this place, more certain that she had been right to come here. She saw Oscar more regularly as October turned to November, with a frequency that could no longer quite be attributed to coincidence. She noticed that when he came to town on Saturdays, he tended to appear near the school around the time she walked home, and she noticed that she had taken to timing her departures a few minutes later on Saturdays in case he happened to be passing. On a Saturday in early November, he arrived at the school just as she was locking the door and offered, very simply, to walk her home. She said yes, equally simply. They walked the length of the main street in the cold, clear afternoon air, their breath making small clouds before them, and talked about everything and nothing. About the winter that was coming, about a stallion Robert wanted to buy that Oscar thought was overpriced, about a novel Etta was reading that she described to him in enough detail that he said he thought he would like to read it too, and she offered to lend it to him when she was finished. "I would like that," he said. She handed the book to him, 3 weeks later, in front of the dry goods store, and when their hands touched in the transfer of it, neither of them moved for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Clara Whitfield was in the 3rd week of November performing a recitation in class that she had been practicing at home when she said, with the transparent confidence of 7 years old, "My uncle says you are the most interesting person in Caldwell, Miss Hurst. He says this to my mother when he thinks I am not listening, but I was listening." The other children found this very interesting. Etta managed her expression with the professional composure she had spent 4 years developing and said, "That is very kind of your uncle, Clara. Now, shall we continue?" She thought about it all afternoon. The next time she saw him, on the following Saturday, she said, because she was her mother's daughter and her mother had never seen the point in circling around what needed to be said, "Your niece has very good hearing." Oscar went very still for just a moment, and then he looked at her, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen there before, caught out, yes, but also something else, something that was almost painfully honest. "I see," he said. "You do not have to say anything about it," she said. "I simply thought you should know." "No," he said. "No, I think I ought to say something about it." He looked down at his hat, which he was holding in both hands in the way he held it when he was choosing his words carefully. I am not a man who talks about what he feels easily. My wife used to say it was like trying to get water from a dry well." A pause, and the ghost of affection that moved across his face at that memory was one of the most honest things she had ever seen on a human face. "But I think you know that I find your company to be," he stopped. "Interesting," she supplied. "More than that," he said quietly. "Considerably more than that." She looked at him for a long moment. "Well," she said, "that is a good start." He looked startled and then genuinely amused, and the smile that broke across his face this time was real and full and entirely different from every other expression she had seen on him, younger and warmer and altogether more alive, and it hit her somewhere in the center of her chest with a force that was entirely disproportionate to the situation. "You are a straightforward woman, Miss Hurst," he said. "I find it saves a great deal of time," she said. He laughed. It was a low, quiet sound, but it was real, and she felt the pleasure of having caused it like something warm in her hands. After that, things moved with a new deliberateness between them. Not rushed. Oscar Whitfield was not a man who did anything in haste, and Etta was not a woman who intended to make the same mistake twice, but with the quiet, certain momentum of something that had been building and could no longer pretend it was not. He began riding out to the school on Friday afternoons to collect Clara, and Etta found reasons to still be in the yard when he arrived. They developed a habit of standing at the school fence and talking while Clara chased the other departing children across the field, and these conversations expanded week by week into something that had the texture of intimacy without yet having the name. He told her about Virginia, about what the war had done to it and to his family, about the older brother they had lost at Cold Harbor in '64 when Oscar had been 14 years old and Robert had been 17, and how his father had never quite recovered from that, and how the two surviving brothers had carried each other through it. He told her about learning to work cattle in Virginia, and then in Tennessee, and then in Missouri, and then here, and how the work had been the constant when everything else changed. She told him about her own family's losses, the younger sister who had died of typhoid fever when Etta was 16, the way her mother had folded grief into faith so seamlessly it became impossible to separate them. She told him about the year she had spent uncertain what to do with herself before a neighbor's wife, suggested that she might be good with children, and helped her get the Abilene position, and how teaching had turned out to be the first thing she had done that felt entirely right. "You are good at it," he said. "Clara talks about school the way she used to talk about Christmas morning." "Clara is a remarkable child," Etta said. "She has your eyes and none of your reticence." He smiled. "That is her mother's influence. Molly Roberts' wife, she could get a conversation out of a fence post." "I should like to meet her properly," Etta said. She had seen Molly Whitfield at church twice, a round-faced, energetic woman who was always in motion and who had smiled at Etta both times with what appeared to be enthusiastic approval. "She would like that too," Oscar said, and then, slightly more carefully, "She has mentioned it." "Has she?" Etta said. "She has mentioned several things," he said, with a degree of suffering in his voice that made Etta press her lips together to keep from smiling. The Thursday before Thanksgiving, a cold and gray day with the wind sliding down from the north in a way that promised real winter, Oscar came to town in the afternoon. Etta saw him through the schoolroom window while the children were doing their sums, and when school finished and the children filed out, he was waiting at the fence. Clara ran to him, and he lifted her with the ease of long practice, setting her against his hip and listening to her account of the day with the particular patience he reserved for her. And Etta, watching from the doorway, felt something so large and so quiet move through her that she had to stand still for a moment before she could walk toward them. She said goodbye to Clara, who embraced her ankles with great conviction, and then accepted her uncle's suggestion that she go wait by the horse. And then it was just the two of them at the fence in the cold afternoon. He reached into his coat pocket, which was something he did without apparently being fully conscious of it, and then he seemed to become aware of what he was doing, and his hand went still against his side. She had seen him do this before, twice. The thing in his pocket that he reached for like a reflex, she knew what it was. She had known since the first morning. "I think," he said, "that you should come to supper on Sunday if you are willing. Robert and Molly want you to come, and I would like you to come." "I would like to come," she said. He nodded and looked at her, and in his pale gray eyes she saw something that was not yet ready to be said, but that was there regardless, present and careful and afraid in the way that only real things are afraid, because only real things have something to lose. "Oscar," she said, and the use of his first name was deliberate and landed on him visibly. "I am in no hurry. I want you to know that." He held her gaze. "I know," he said. "I think that is one of the things that is something I value greatly. About you." Sunday came bright and cold and still, the kind of November day that was almost too beautiful, the sky a hard blue, the grass silver-white with frost that had not yet melted. Oscar arrived at Mrs. Prentice's at 10:30 with Clara on the horse beside him, and a spare horse borrowed from Robert, a bay mare who was steady and well-mannered. Etta could ride adequately if not particularly well, having learned out of necessity in Missouri, and the 8 miles south to the Whitfield ranch was a ride she was glad to make. The ranch was everything he had described and more. The land rolled in long, easy swells toward the territory line, broken by draws and dry creek beds, and the one good creek that ran clear and cold through the south pasture. The house Oscar lived in was a solid, capable structure, not large but well built, with a stone fireplace and wood floors that had been laid with care. The barn was the larger and more impressive building, which told you immediately what the man valued. Robert and Molly's house was a quarter-mile up the ridge, slightly higher on the land, and Molly met them in the yard with the energy of a woman who had been looking forward to this for longer than was entirely reasonable. She was exactly as Etta had imagined bright-eyed, quick-talking, with hands that were always doing something even while she was speaking, and a laugh that went off like a firecracker. She embraced Etta immediately, which was not a conventional greeting but was so genuinely warm that it was impossible to take exception to it. "I am so glad," she said. "I have been so glad you are in Caldwell, Miss Hurst. Etta, I am going to call you Etta. Clara, come in from the cold, your ears are red." Supper was roasted chicken and sweet potatoes and biscuits so good that Etta nearly asked for the recipe on the spot. Robert Whitfield was exactly the taller, louder, more outwardly relaxed version of his brother that he had appeared from across the church hall, generous with his opinions, easy with his laughter, and also, she noticed, quietly and carefully watchful of Oscar in the way of someone who loved him and had been concerned about him for a long time. Oscar, at the table with his family around him, was different than he was in town, more at ease in his body, slightly more inclined to speak without it costing him, and once he told a story about a horse named Judas who had terrorized the ranch for a summer, and the whole table laughed, and Etta saw in that laughing, relaxed face the man he might have been more consistently, might be again, and it was a compelling thing to witness. After supper, while Robert and Molly washed up and Clara fell asleep in a chair by the fire, Oscar took Etta outside to see the cottonwood grove he had told her about. The sun was getting low, orange and heavy, and the cottonwoods were past their gold now, but the bare silver-white branches against that orange sky were something else entirely, something stark and clean and beautiful in the way that bare things can be beautiful. They stood at the edge of the grove, and she could feel the warmth of him standing close beside her in the cold. "I buried her here," he said. "Joe, under the furthest tree." He said it quietly, not as pain but as information, as something she should know now that she was standing here. She loved these trees. She said they sounded like rain even when there was no rain. Etta listened and heard it, the dry rustle of the few remaining leaves in the light wind, a sound that was absolutely, unmistakably like the sound of distant rain. "She was right," Etta said softly. "She was right about most things," he said. He reached into his coat pocket, that reflex, and this time he drew it out. He opened his hand, and there was the ring, small and gold in the last of the sunlight, a simple band with a small engraved pattern around the outside that she could not quite make out. He held it on his open palm and looked at it for a long moment. "I have been carrying this since January," he said, "since she died. I did not know what to do with it, and I could not put it down." He paused. "I know that is not entirely rational." "It is entirely rational," Etta said. "You carry what you love." He looked at her then, sideways, and with that expression that was almost painfully honest, the one she had been cataloging since she met him. "I do not want to put it in the ground," he said. "I do not want to leave it here, but I think—" he closed his fingers around it again gently. "I think perhaps it is time for it to be somewhere other than my pocket." "What will you do with it?" she asked. "I had thought—" he paused for a long moment. "I had thought perhaps a small box. Something I could keep in the house. Something where it was safe and honored, but where I was not carrying it every moment as if I were afraid to let her go entirely." "She will not go entirely," Etta said. "That is not how it works. She is in that tree and in this land and in you. Putting the ring in a box is not the same as letting her go." He was very still for a moment. Then, "No," he said. "No, I think you are right. Keep the ring," she said. "Put it somewhere safe. Somewhere you can look at it when you want to and not when you do not." She paused, aware of the cold air and the sound of the cottonwoods. "She loved you enough to come out here and build all of this with you. That deserves to be honored properly, not carried like a wound." He turned to look at her fully now, and in the failing light his eyes were silver and direct and so full of something she had no word for yet that she had to steady herself against it. "Etta," he said. It was the first time he had used her first name. She felt it all the way through her. "Yes," she said. "I think you may be the most. I think that you have—" He stopped and seemed to be trying to reassemble his thoughts. "I find that you make me want to be something better than I have been this year," he said finally. "And I find that the prospect of that does not frighten me the way it would have a few months ago." She looked at him in the orange light with the cottonwoods whispering behind them. "That is a very good thing to say," she said. "I have been working on it," he said, and this time the smile was immediate and real and warm, and she laughed, and he laughed, and the sound of it went up into the bare silver branches and the orange sky, and it felt like something beginning. December arrived, and the winter settled in properly, and the rhythm of Etta's life in Caldwell took on a warmth it had not had before. She and Oscar saw each other twice a week at minimum now, and the quality of their time together had changed, less careful, more willing to simply be in each other's company, without the ceremony of conversation as a shield. He came to town on the first Saturday of December and asked her to come and look at a piece of land with him, a small plot on the east side of his property, where he was thinking of building a new structure for storing winter feed, and he wanted a second opinion on whether the ground looked right for it. She said yes immediately, which made him smile in the way she had categorized as reserved but genuine, the best category. The ride out was cold but bright, and they rode side by side on the long, empty land and talked easily. She had become comfortable with horses, or at least with this horse, and she rode better than she had in Missouri, which she attributed to the fact that she was no longer nervous, and being relaxed made everything with a horse considerably more straightforward. The land he showed her was good land, a slight rise with good drainage, and she said so with the confidence of a woman who had grown up watching her father make practical decisions about land and buildings, and knew enough to have an opinion. He listened to her with complete attention and then agreed with her assessment and seemed genuinely pleased that she had been definitive about it. They stood on the rise and looked out over the property in the winter light, and she could see for miles the long roll of the land to the south toward the territory line, the thin silver line of the creek, the cottonwood grove, and there in the valley the house where he lived. "It is a beautiful place," she said again, the same thing she had said the first time he described it. But she meant it differently now. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I want to ask you something." She waited. "I want to ask you if you would be willing to let this become something more formal," he said, "between us. I am asking if you would allow me to court you properly. I know the term perhaps sounds old-fashioned, but I want to be clear about my intentions." He paused. "My intentions are serious, Etta. I want you to know that." She looked at him in the clear, cold light of that December morning, at the man who had been sitting in the dust with his dead wife's ring in his fist when she found him, who had been patient and honest and careful with her from the very beginning, who made her laugh and made her think and made her want to ride out into cold mornings on his land and stand on rises and look at things with him. "Oscar," she said, "your intentions have been perfectly clear for quite some time. Yes, yes, I am willing." He let out a breath that was visible in the cold air and looked so profoundly relieved that she laughed. And then he laughed too, and he reached over and took her gloved hand in his with the simple ease of a decision made. And they stood like that in the winter light and looked out over the beautiful, difficult land. The weeks that followed were among the best of Etta's life. Christmas came to Caldwell with the communal warmth that frontier towns create in winter, because winter on the plains was not a small thing, and warmth was something you built together deliberately, or you did not have it at all. There was a church service on Christmas Eve that the whole town attended, and she stood beside Oscar with Clara asleep against his shoulder and Robert and Molly warm on her other side, and she felt something so complete and so undemonstrative about her contentment that she almost could not hold it. After the service he walked her home, and at Mrs. Prentice's door, in the cold dark of Christmas Eve with the stars absolutely blazing overhead in the way they did in Kansas when there was no cloud and no moon, he stopped and turned to her. "I have something for you," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and she felt the reflexive awareness of what he kept there, but what he drew out was something different, a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. She opened it and found a slim leather-bound book, a collection of poems, with a note inside in his careful handwriting. "For Etta, who finds the right words when I cannot." O.W. She looked up at him, and his face in the starlight was open and serious and entirely present. "Thank you," she said. "It is the best thing I have received in years." He reached out and very gently, very deliberately, tucked a strand of hair that the wind had blown across her face back behind her ear. His fingers barely touched her cheek, but she felt it with an intensity that was entirely disproportionate to the lightness of the touch. "Merry Christmas, Etta," he said. "Merry Christmas, Oscar," she said, and she went inside before she did something entirely impractical. January was hard, the cold was real and serious, the kind of plains winter that reminded you that the land was not domesticated, that it was simply tolerating you. Oscar worked hard on the ranch through it, and she taught through it, and they saw each other on Saturdays with a regularity that had become something the town noticed and approved of in the comfortable way that small communities approve of things that make sense to them. On a Saturday in January, he came to collect her for a ride, and she noticed immediately that something was different in him. He was not lighter exactly, but more present than he had been, more entirely himself. She did not ask about it until they were out on the land and riding east toward the creek, where the ice was melting along the edges, and the cottonwoods were bare and silver against a pale winter sky. "I put it in a box," he said without preamble. She knew immediately what he meant. "When?" "Christmas night," he said. "I went home and I found the right box. There is a small cedar box that Joe brought from Ohio, the one she kept her mother's things in. Her mother passed before we married, and I put the ring inside and I put the box on the mantel." He was quiet for a moment. "And I slept the night through for the first time since January of last year." Etta said nothing for a moment, just rode beside him in the winter quiet. Then she said, "Good." It felt, he paused, choosing. It felt like I was honoring her correctly, finally, instead of just holding on to the damage. "That is exactly what it is," Etta said. He looked at her. "I know it is because of you," he said. "I know I would not have. I am not saying the grief is gone. It is not. But it is in its right place now, I think. And that is because you helped me see where the right place was." She felt the warmth of this settle through her. "You knew it," she said. "You just needed someone to stand beside you while you found it." He reached over on horseback and took her hand again, the way he had in December, that easy and certain gesture that was becoming one of the most dependable joys of her days. And they rode along the creek in the January cold, and she thought about how life had a way of finding you in streets where you had gone to do something else entirely. February came in cold and clear, and with February came the thing that had been building since October with the steady patience of something that knew where it was going. On the first Sunday of February, he drove out to Mrs. Prentice's in the buggy, which was unusual. He almost always rode, and he was dressed in his good coat. Etta was already suspicious before she was halfway down the stairs. He asked Mrs. Prentice if he might speak with Etta privately in the front parlor, which Mrs. Prentice facilitated with enormous discretion and an expression of bright approval that she made almost no effort to conceal. He stood in the parlor with his hat in his hands, and she stood across from him, and they looked at each other. "I have been practicing what I was going to say," he said. "That is very thorough of you," she said. "I have been practicing it for approximately 3 weeks," he said. "Then I am looking forward to hearing it." He took a breath. "Etta," he said, "I came to Caldwell in '74 as a man who needed empty space and work. I found both, and I found Joe, and I built something here that I did not think I would build. When Joe died, I thought I would just continue, that I would just work and continue, and that would be enough." He paused. "You walked almost over me in the street in September, and you asked if I was all right, and I do not know how to explain to you what it was like to have someone ask that question and mean it, when I had been trying for 8 months not to ask it of myself." She was very still and very listening. "You are the most clear-eyed person I have ever met," he said. "You are the most honest and the most warm and the most—" He stopped. "The word I want is not adequate," he said. "I find that my vocabulary fails me consistently where you are concerned, which, given that you are a teacher, I find slightly humiliating." She laughed. She could not help it, and he looked startled, and then the relief in his face was enormous and real. "Etta Hurst," he said, "I love you. I want you to know that I love you with something that is entirely new and is entirely itself, and is not a replacement or a substitute or a second attempt at something else. It is its own thing. You are your own thing." He steadied himself. "Will you marry me? I know I am asking for a great deal. I know this ranch is a difficult life, and I know there is a grave under the cottonwood trees, and I know that I am a man who takes longer than most to say what he means. But I will spend my life trying to deserve whatever you will give me, and I will spend it here, and I would spend it gladly." She crossed the parlor and took both his hands in hers, the hat falling between them onto the floor, and looked up at him with her full, direct, creek-water gaze. "I love you," she said. "Yes. Yes, I will marry you. And Oscar, the grave and the ring and Joe, none of that is a condition I am accepting. It is part of you and I am accepting you. All of it." He brought her hands up and held them against his chest, above his heart, and she could feel it beating steadily and strongly under her palms. And he bent his head down and rested his forehead against hers, and they stayed like that in the quiet parlor for a long moment, his breath warm against her face, the winter light coming through the window. "She would have liked you," he said softly. "Joe, she would have liked you enormously." "I hope so," Etta said. "I think I would have liked her." He kissed her then, gently and deliberately, and she kissed him back with the whole of the decision she had been building toward for 5 months. And when they parted, they were both smiling in the dazed, certain way of people who have just confirmed something they already knew. Mrs. Prentice appeared in the doorway approximately 30 seconds later with an expression of absolute satisfaction and the announcement that she had put coffee on. The spring came early to the Kansas plains that year, arriving in March with a warmth that felt like a gift, the grass greening fast and the creek running high with snowmelt, and the sky cycling through an extraordinary range of blue and cloud and clean-washed light. Etta walked out to the ranch on Sunday mornings when the weather was good, a walk she had come to love, the 8 miles of open country, the way the land changed from the outskirts of Caldwell into something wilder and more particular, the moment when the ranch came into view in the low distance. They planned the wedding for May, which gave enough time to do it properly and not so much time that it felt like waiting. Molly threw herself into the planning with an energy that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this occasion and was going to make full use of it. Robert, when Oscar told him, shook his brother's hand for a long time and then said quietly that he was glad, and the way he said it told you everything about the year it had been. There was a moment in April, a warm afternoon when Etta was at the ranch and they were sitting on the front step in the last of the day's light, that she asked him about the ring. Not probing, not concerned, just asking because she wanted to know. "It is on the mantel in the cedar box," he said. "I look at it sometimes, not often, but sometimes." He was quiet. "It is enough. It is the right amount." "Good," she said. She leaned into his shoulder and he put his arm around her and they watched the sun go down over the territory line and the light turn gold and then orange and then the deep rose of a plains evening. "When you asked me to keep it," he said, "that first time by the cottonwoods, I did not ask you to keep it," she said. "I said it deserved to be honored properly. You chose to keep it." "I know," he said. "But the way you said it, it gave me a way to think about it that I had not had." He paused. "You gave me permission to love her and love you, both things, not one replacing the other." She lifted her head and looked at him. "That is because both things are true," she said. "And you are large enough for both of them. You always were. You just needed someone to say so." He looked at her with that expression, the one she had named to herself as his real face, the one without the grief or the guard or the careful choosing of words, just the man himself looking at her with an openness she knew was not given easily and was given completely. "Etta," he said. "Yes," she said, though he had not asked anything. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know that the answer does not change anything between us and that I will be equally glad regardless of what you say." "That is a very careful preamble," she said. "The ring," he said. "Joe's ring. I have been thinking I want it to stay in the box. That is where it belongs. It is hers and it is going to stay hers." He paused. "But I want to give you a ring that is entirely yours. I want to go to the jeweler in Caldwell and have something made that belongs to you and to this, to what we are building. Not a replacement, something new." He looked at her steadily. "Would you wear it? If I gave you a ring that was wholly and only yours?" She felt the question in the exact specific way it was meant, understood the distinction he was drawing with the care of a man who meant everything he said precisely. A ring that is hers and a ring that is yours, and the ring that is yours is not standing in for the ring that is hers. It is simply the ring that is yours, belonging to something that is new and specific and its own thing. Yes, she said, I would wear it. I would be proud to wear it. He exhaled slowly. Good, he said, good. He rode into Caldwell 3 days later and spent an hour with the jeweler, a precise and earnest man named Mr. Hannigan, who had a small shop between the hardware store and the land office. He ordered a ring made of gold with a small garnet set into it, because he had heard Etta say once, in passing, that garnets were her favorite stone, the deep red of them like good wine, and Mr. Hannigan said it would be ready in 6 weeks, which would be just in time for May. The wedding was on the 19th of May, 1879. The day was exactly what a May wedding in Kansas should be, warm and bright with a good, clean breeze that kept the heat from becoming too much, and the sky so blue it seemed to press down on the land with a kind of gentle weight. The church was full, which was not entirely surprising, because Caldwell by now was invested in this as though it were a community project, which in some ways it was. Molly had made Etta a dress in a cream-colored fabric with small blue flowers embroidered at the collar, which Etta put on in the small vestry of the church, with Molly's hands doing up the back buttons with practiced efficiency and Clara sitting in the corner watching with enormous gray eyes, and the expression of someone witnessing something she intended to remember. "You look beautiful," Molly said. "I am going to cry. I am telling you now so it does not surprise you." "I would expect nothing less," Etta said, and squeezed her hands. Robert walked her up the aisle, which had been his suggestion and her grateful acceptance, and when she came through the door and saw the full church and then saw Oscar at the front of it, she stopped for just one breath. He was in his good coat, dark and pressed, and he had a white flower in the buttonhole that Clara had apparently put there that morning by standing on a chair. He was standing with his hands clasped in front of him, and his face was the realest she had ever seen it, not controlled, not careful, not managing anything. Just him, entirely and completely, watching her come toward him with an expression that made Robert, beside her, clear his throat. She reached the front and Oscar took her hand and she felt it, the warmth and certainty of it, the same as it had been on the rise looking out over the ranch in December, the same as it had been in Mrs. Prentice's parlor in February, the same and more and deeper. Reverend Clark, who had married enough frontier couples to know when something was real, and when it was not, read the words with the particular gravity he reserved for occasions that deserved it. When he asked Oscar if he took Etta Hurst to be his wife, Oscar said, "I do," with a clarity and a steadiness that was entirely his own. When he asked Etta if she took Oscar Whitfield to be her husband, she said, "I do," with a warmth and a certainty that made Mrs. Prentice, 2 rows back, produce a handkerchief. Mr. Hannigan's ring came out of Oscar's pocket, the right pocket, not the left where he used to keep Joe's ring, and she noticed this and was moved by the careful deliberateness of it. It was perfect, gold, small garnet, warm and specific and entirely hers. He slid it onto her finger and it fit as though it had been there always. He kissed her in front of the whole church with the kind of absolute commitment that made several people applaud and Clara say loudly from the front pew, "Finally," which produced general laughter, and which was, by any measure, the best thing that happened all day. They spent their first days as a married couple at the ranch, which was where they both wanted to be, and Caldwell managed fine without either of them for a week. Etta found the house was already a house she loved. She had spent enough Sundays in it by now to know its character, but there was a pleasure in being in it as herself, as its person, that was new and specific and very fine. She moved her things from Mrs. Prentice's room, which took one trip with the buggy, because she had not acquired much in Caldwell, and what she had acquired that mattered was already partly at the ranch in the small shelf of books she had been leaving there one at a time over the winter. Mrs. Prentice said good-bye with great warmth, and the recipe for the coffee that Etta had been trying to replicate for 7 months, which was the most valuable thing she could have given her. The cedar box was on the mantel. She saw it the first morning and looked at it quietly, the way you look at a thing that means something without touching it. Oscar came in from outside and saw her looking at it and came to stand beside her. "That is all right," she said before he could speak. "It belongs there." "Yes," he said. He put his hand on the small of her back in the way he had developed, the touch that was always there when she was beside him. "It does." She leaned into him. "Good morning, husband," she said. She had only been able to say that for 4 days and it still felt remarkable. "Good morning, wife," he said. With the warmth that she had come to understand was Oscar Whitfield's version of joy, not loud, not demonstrative, but deep and steady and entirely reliable, like the creek and the cottonwoods and the land itself. The spring opened into summer, and summer was the fullness of what they were building. Etta kept her teaching position, which the town had assumed she would and was pleased about, and Oscar continued the work of the ranch. And their life together had the texture of two people who had both been alone long enough to understand that what they had now was worth tending with care. They had supper with Robert and Molly on Sundays, a tradition that became as settled and expected as the weather. Clara was at the ranch often, which was something both Oscar and Etta loved. Clara with her bright gray eyes and her absolute opinions, and her habit of reading aloud from whatever book she had borrowed from Etta's shelf, sitting on the front step in the summer evenings while the adults sat behind her and listened. Oscar was different in the summer, not different from who he had always been, but more fully present in that person, more willing to be easy, to laugh, to sit in the evening without working. He built a porch swing in June and it became their place, the long summer evenings on the swing with the land spreading out before them and the cottonwoods making their rain sound in the south. "I did not know," he said one evening, "that this was what was possible." "What do you mean?" "This," he said, "this specific thing, being here like this at the end of the day with you." He was quiet for a moment. "I knew happiness before. But I think I had decided, somewhere in the last year, that it was a thing that had already happened to me, that it was in the past and I was going to be all right, but that this particular thing was finished." She took his hand on the swing. And now I know I was wrong," he said, "and I am very glad I was wrong." She brought his hand up and pressed her mouth to his knuckles, the way she sometimes did when words felt like too much. He turned their joined hands and pressed his lips to the garnet ring, the same way she had, and they sat in the evening and listened to the land. In August, she told him she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, over coffee, simply and directly, because she was not a woman for elaborate gestures. She said, "I believe we are going to have a child in the spring." He set down his coffee cup with enormous care. "Spring," he said. "March or April, I think," she said, "though these things are not a precise science." He looked at her across the kitchen table in the August morning light, and she saw something move through his face that she had not quite seen before, joy so intense it was almost pain, and the shadow of fear underneath it, and then something else, something very steady and very certain, rising up through all of it. "Etta," he said. "I know," she said. "I know what you are thinking." "Do you?" "You are thinking about Joe," she said quietly and without accusation, "about what happened, and you are frightened." He was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "I am not Joe," she said. "I am not saying that as a comfort, I am saying it as a fact. This pregnancy is its own thing and it is going to be all right." She reached across the table and took his hand. "And we are going to have the doctor from Caldwell and Molly and every resource available to us, and it is going to be all right." He turned his hand over and held hers. "I believe you," he said. "I am trying to." "That is enough," she said. "Trying is enough." He came around the table and knelt beside her chair and put both arms around her, and she held him and felt the fear and the joy in him both, and loved him for not pretending the fear was not there. "A child," he said against her hair. "A child," she confirmed. He leaned back and looked at her with his whole face completely open. "I am going to be someone's father," he said. with a wonder that was so new and unguarded it made her eyes sting. "Yes," she said, "and you are going to be very good at it." He kissed her then, long and warm in the August morning kitchen, and she felt it in her hands and her feet and the small, certain center of everything she was. The news spread through the family in the way that good news spreads, with immediate and uncontainable delight. Molly's reaction involved a considerable number of words delivered at high speed, and a second embrace even more enthusiastic than the first one Etta had received upon arriving in Caldwell. Robert shook Oscar's hand with both of his and said, roughly, that he was glad, and Clara said she hoped it was a girl so she could teach her things, and Robert said she was not going to do any teaching until she was done being taught, and Clara looked at Oscar with an expression that asked if this was reasonable, and Oscar bit down on a smile and looked at the wall. The pregnancy progressed as good pregnancies do, with the expected difficulties, the mornings that were harder, the afternoons of tiredness that settled like a second gravity, and alongside those things the expanding astonishment of the whole business, the way the world seemed to be rearranging itself around a new center. Oscar was attentive with the particular attention of a man who understood the stakes and was determined not to be absent for them. He was up before her, he ensured she was warm, he made coffee exactly right, he listened when she talked and he held her when she was tired, and he was afraid in the precise healthy proportion of someone who loved someone and wanted them safe. Dr. Calhoun from Caldwell came in October for an initial consultation and pronounced everything as it should be, and said the same again in December. Etta continued teaching until January, when the cold and the effort of the growing pregnancy made walking the school distance impractical. She taught from home for the last weeks of winter, with Alderman Cooper's blessing and several of the older children taking turns coming to the ranch with the assignments, which turned into a minor adventure for them and a practical solution for everyone. The winter of 1879 going into 1880 was gentler than the previous year, as though the land had decided to offer something in consideration of what was happening on its surface. The cottonwoods had their bare winter beauty, and the creek ran under its thin ice, and Oscar came in from the cold each evening to the warm kitchen, and the lit lamp, and the person who had made his house a home in a way it had not been since before the grief, and the gratitude he felt was so large he sometimes could not look directly at it. The baby came on the 15th of March, 1880, which was a Monday, in the middle of a mild and clear morning with Dr. Calhoun present and Molly there, and Oscar waiting outside the bedroom door with the stillness of a man exercising every discipline he possessed. The baby was a boy. He was put into his father's arms 20 minutes after he entered the world, wrapped in the blanket Molly had made, and Oscar Whitfield held his son with both hands and looked at him with an expression that Etta, watching from the bed, thought she would carry with her for the rest of her life, the absolute wonder of it, the way it erased everything but the immediate fact of this small, complete, demanding person. "He is perfect," Oscar said. His voice was very low. "He is," Etta agreed. She was exhausted and warm and more certain of everything than she had ever been. He looked at her over their son's head with his whole heart on his face. "Are you all right?" he said, and it was an echo of her own first question to him in the street in September 1878, asked with the same plainness and the same sincerity, and she felt the full circle of that, the way things find each other. "I am more than all right," she said. "Come here." He sat carefully on the edge of the bed and she leaned into his side, their son between them, and the morning light came through the curtains, and the cottonwoods made their rain sound in the south pasture, and the land was as beautiful as it had ever been. "What shall we name him?" Oscar said. She had thought about this for weeks without settling. She looked at the small face, the way it already had the set of Oscar's jaw, the way it was so entirely new and so entirely its own thing. "Thomas," she said. "Thomas for my father and James for yours." "Thomas James Whitfield," he said, and his voice on the name was a consecration. "Yes." Clara arrived that afternoon with Robert and Molly in a state of barely contained impatience, and upon being allowed to look at Thomas James, Whitfield declared him satisfactory, though smaller than expected, and immediately offered to read to him, which Dr. Calhoun said he was almost certainly too young for, and Clara said was probably wrong. The years that followed settled into the good weight of a life that had been chosen carefully and built with care. The ranch grew, a second barn, more cattle, the new feed structure on the East Rise that had been the first thing Oscar had asked Etta's opinion about, completed at last in the summer of 1880. Corbin and Pete stayed on, and Pete eventually married a woman from town and built a small house on the northwest corner of the property, which made the ranch feel more like a community and less like a solitary enterprise. Etta returned to teaching in the fall of 1880, with Thomas in a basket in the corner of the schoolroom, which the children found fascinating, and which turned out to be entirely practical since Thomas had a temperament as steady as his father's and slept through most of the school day with admirable consistency. She was a better teacher than she had been, she thought, though it was difficult to say precisely why. Perhaps it was that she was happier, and happiness has a way of expanding your available patience. Perhaps it was that the specific act of watching someone grow from newborn to person, up close and constant, had given her additional insight into the small people she taught. Whatever the cause, the school in Caldwell thrived, and children came from further out to attend it, and she was proud of that the way she was proud of Thomas and the way she was proud of her own life with a quiet and steady confidence. The cedar box stayed on the mantel. It was simply part of the house now, one of its objects like the lamp and the clock. Sometimes in the evenings when she passed it, she would touch it lightly with her fingertips. Not often, but sometimes. It seemed like the right thing. She had told Oscar once that Joe would always be part of this place, and this was simply and plainly true. The grave under the furthest cottonwood was tended. Oscar went there sometimes, and Etta went with him sometimes, and other times he went alone, and both ways were correct. There was no contradiction in loving someone who was gone and loving someone who was here. This had been the thing she had understood from the beginning, from the very first conversation by the cottonwoods in November, and it had turned out to be exactly true. Thomas was 2 when Etta found herself expecting again, and this time the fear was smaller, not absent. Fear for the people you love is never absent, but smaller and more manageable, sitting in its proper place. Oscar was calmer too, more anchored, and they moved through the second pregnancy with the confidence of people who had done this before and come through well. The second child arrived in the spring of 1883, a girl this time, with Etta's dark hair and something in the set of her eyes that was entirely her own. They named her Rose, which was Molly's suggestion, and which both of them immediately knew was right. Rose was from her first weeks a person of strong opinion and considerable volume, which Clara greeted with delight, and Thomas regarded with the measured caution of a 3-year-old, who had previously had the full attention of the household. In the summer of 1883, on a warm June evening, Etta and Oscar were on the porch swing with the plains spreading out before them in the long golden light, the sounds of Thomas and Rose in the house behind them managed by Molly, who had declared an intention to take them for the evening, and had arrived with decisive cheerfulness. The cottonwoods were moving in the south breeze, making their sound, and Oscar had his arm around her in the way that was as natural as breathing by now, and the garnet ring was warm on her finger and the light was extraordinary. "I have been thinking," Oscar said, "about something." "About what?" "About the day you found me in the street," he said. "About what I must have looked like." "You looked like a man who was carrying too much weight alone," she said. "I was," he said. "I was sitting there with that ring in my hand, and I had been sitting there for an hour, I think, possibly longer. I was not doing well." "I know," she said. "And you asked if I was all right," he said. "That was all, you just asked." "It seemed like the right question." "It was the only question," he said. It was the first time in 8 months that someone had simply asked me that, without an agenda or a solution, without trying to fix me or redirect me, just asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I thought about you all the way home that day. Thought, who is that woman, and I thought I would probably never see her again." "You nearly did not," Etta said. "I almost took the stage to Dodge instead." He turned to look at her with an alarm that was several months too late and was entirely genuine. "What?" "There was a teaching position in Dodge," she said. "I had a letter about it. I chose Caldwell because Mrs. Prentice had advertised the room in the Abilene paper and the rate was lower." "Mrs. Prentice and her reasonable room rate," he said. "Her very reasonable room rate," Etta agreed. He shook his head slowly, and the expression on his face was one that she recognized as his version of being overwhelmed, very still and very quiet, looking at something large. "I owe that woman a debt I cannot repay," he said. Etta laughed and leaned into him. "You can pay it in gratitude. She will accept that." He held her closer and looked out over their land, in the golden evening light. Thomas James Whitfield, age 3, appeared at the screen door and pressed his face against it and said, "Papa," with the specificity of a child who had decided the moment had gone on long enough, and Oscar turned and looked at his son with that expression, the one that had been there since the first morning in March 1880, the absolute and unguarded wonder of it. "In a moment," he said. Thomas pressed his face harder against the screen. "In a moment, Thomas," Etta said. Thomas accepted this with the philosophical resignation of a small person who has learned that adults on the porch swing require a certain tolerance. Oscar put his mouth against her hair and said, very quietly, "Etta." "Yes," she said. "I want you to know," he said, "that I understand what you gave me. Not just now, not just the children and the life, but you gave me back the ability to be here, in my own life. You gave me that before you were anything to me, before I was anything to you. You just asked me if I was all right and you meant it, and it was everything." She turned and looked at him. The light was in his pale gray eyes and they were warm and steady, looking at her with the whole of the life they had made together behind them. "You would have found your way," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but not here, not to this." He touched her face with his free hand. "Not to you." She held his gaze and let herself simply receive that, the full clear weight of it without deflecting it or diminishing it. He meant it, every word, with the precise and absolute sincerity that was the most essential thing about him. He had always meant what he said. "I love you," she said. "I love you, and I love this life, and I love this land, and I love the children, and I love the way you are in all of it. I want you to know that." He kissed her, and it was a kiss that contained all of that, everything she had said and everything they had been. The street in September and the cottonwoods in November, and the snow and the church and the August morning in the kitchen and the March morning with Thomas, and every evening on this swing with the plains going gold around them. When they parted, Thomas had been joined by Rose, who was holding the screen door open and had apparently been studying the situation and found it acceptable, because she had the expression of someone who had reviewed the available information and come to a satisfactory conclusion, very much her father's expression on a 2-year-old face. And Oscar looked at her and laughed, and Etta laughed, and the laughter went up into the warm June evening. He got up and opened the screen door and lifted Rose with one arm and took Thomas by the hand, and Etta rose from the swing and they went inside to their warm, noisy, real and living house. The cedar box was on the mantel in the lamplight. The garnet ring was on her finger, warm and specific and entirely hers. The porch swing creaked slightly in the evening breeze outside, and the cottonwoods made their sound in the south pasture, and the land spread out in all directions under the enormous Kansas sky, beautiful and difficult and full of everything they had built in it. And it was, as Oscar had once said about this place in a different and earlier conversation, a beautiful, difficult, thoroughly wonderful life.